So my name is Karis. I'm a member of Justice League, and this segment, we're wrapping up this segment with what do we do next? And we know that we have folks that follow us, and this movement is up and going, and people want to know what is it that we do next? How do we keep pressure? And like Nia mentioned, how do we continue this people power? So this segment on the panel, I have with me Dr. Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter LA. I have New York State Assembly member Michael Blake, who represents the 79th District in the Bronx. Bronx is here. We have Anthony DiMartino from Californians for Justice and Safety. And we have London Arnold Justice Committee from Justice Committee. Welcome. This panel is made up of activists, policy experts we're going to talk about how much policy is important in this movement and how we can use policy and legislation to undo the systemic issues that we face in policing. And so we did hear earlier today, for those who've been watching all evening with us, we heard earlier from family members of those who were murdered by police, talk a little bit about some of the things that we've won in New York State, like the repeal of 50A, the Police Stat Act. And London, if you can just give us a quick overview of those policies and how it's connected to this overall liberation and undoing some of these systemic barriers.
Yeah, sure. So the Police Stat Act gives us data on police killings and low-level police enforcement across the state and allows us to know more intimate information about police killings and those enforcements. And so when 50A was repealed, it allowed us to tear down that wall of secrecy that the NYPD and other New York police departments use in using ways to protect abusive police officers and keep things under wraps as far as misconduct reports go. And so the special prosecutor bill is a bill that would allow all cases, regardless of if the victim was allegedly armed, to be tried by a special prosecutor. And it's something that the families who you may have heard from earlier have been demanding for years. So all three of these were very, very big victories. And right now what's happening in New York City and New York State is that families and those of us who have been working on these bills are now having to defend them because they're now currently under attack by New York City police unions. And so they're trying to roll back the repeal of 50A, which would allow or not allow us to be able to get that misconduct data. And we recognize that this is common for police unions to do because we know that there's a history of police secrecy and shielding abusive officers. But so we're now in this fight where we're trying to maintain the repeal of 50A and our wins with these other two bills.
Thank you. Thank you for that, just that overview. We have folks on, this is a coast to coast. As we know, Justice League is a national organization. We have Justice League NYC and Justice League California. We are coast to coast here, and California has some really big legislative things on the table right now. I want to bring to attention a bill that is being proposed that would strip convicted officers of their badges in California. California is one of 5 states that currently do not have the authority to take away officers' badge for crimes and serious misconduct. So, Dr. Abdullah or Anthony, could you speak a little bit to this bill that's being proposed and why it's important?
Sure. Anthony, you want me to go first, or? Yeah, okay. So one of the bills that we're working on is a police decertification bill, which does exactly what you're saying. So we know that many times when police kill our people, it's not their first murder. And so we have a decertification bill that's moving. that's being sponsored by State Senator Steve Bradford, and that's being offered in the name of Kenneth Ross Jr. And we hope that everyone pulls up the video of Kenneth Ross Jr. that remembers the name Kenneth Ross Jr. One of the challenges that we have in California is that so many people are killed by police, especially in Los Angeles County, that sometimes the names and stories get lost. Kenneth Ross Jr. was murdered by an officer named Michael Robbins at a park in Gardena, California, which is right outside of Oakland. This was Michael Robbins' fourth shooting. Michael Robbins had been an officer in Orange, the city of Orange, California, and then moved, which is what many officers do, and many people are familiar, for instance, with what happened with the officer who murdered Tamir Rice, that he was able to jump from Cleveland to another locale, right? Because they're not decertified. If they are not prosecuted, right, then it really opens it up. And in Los Angeles County, 610 people have been killed by police and none of them have been prosecuted, right? So even when they're fired, they're able to jump to another locale. This decertification bill, which is named in honor of Kenneth Ross Jr., who was killed again by Michael Robbins in his fourth shooting. Kenneth Ross was a wonderful young man, an active father, was a support to his mother. He was simply walking down the street in broad daylight at like 1:30 in the afternoon. And Officer Michael Robbins, Sergeant Michael Robbins, got a call about supposedly gunshots in the area, trains his sights on Kenneth Ross, and says to himself, this is gonna be a good one, and then murders him like he was playing a video game, right? So I want everybody to see it for themselves, but also to say the name Kenneth Ross Jr. and be familiar with that story. So one of the pieces of legislation we're working on says that we shouldn't have to wait for problematic DAs who are in bed with police on every other case to prosecute officers that they're never going to prosecute, to remove them from the streets. We can decertify them without relying on DAs to do that.
Thank you. Anthony, did you want to add anything around that, around this? Go ahead.
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, Dr. Abdullah, hit it perfectly on this. I think this speaks to what's going on across the country, but also California has been moving in a positive direction over the last several years, right? And I think in an earlier segment, SB 1421 was mentioned. There's going to be more legislation around opening up officer records this year. There's over 12 bills I've counted that have been introduced that are looking at officer records, decertification, use of force, how they handle themselves at protests. And so, systematically, California is really looking at these issues, but there's so much more work to be done. But really applaud Dr. Abdullah and all those others that are working on these issues. I was a staffer just last year, and so coming on the outside now and getting to be in the fight with all the nonprofits and CBOs has been an honor. So really appreciate being here, and just recognize that there's a lot of work to be done, but there's some really good bills moving this year that we have a chance to sign into law by the end of this year.
Thank you. Dr. Abdullah brought in DAs and the role that DAs play. Assemblyman Michael Blake, we thank you for all your efforts and everything that you've done in the state assembly trying to get legislation passed. We know we've got the chokehold ban. We have this at the state level, we have bans on chokehold, even though the NYPD already has a ban on chokeholds, but that did not prevent the murder of Eric Garner, as we know. What do you say about recently we have DAs saying how we had the chief of police come out and DAs are saying, it's really up to them if they enforce this. How does that play a role in, at the legislative, folks are doing what they need to do, but if we don't have DAs that are going to enforce and charge officers, what does that say about the entire system and how we decertify and defund not just police, but also going after DAs who will not prosecute these cases.
My sister, always good to see you. First of all, you can call me Michael. I know we all get caught in titles out here, but
Yes.
It's all good. And I feel like I got that California heat. It's like 95 degrees out here right now. The oppressor will never give up anything. And when we think about what we are watching and witnessing right now, and I am going to directly answer your question, but I got to show love to the California team that is here, because I just want you to know we watch what you all do regularly. You know, and my conversations with Mike De La Rocha and so many others, and Lindy and everybody that's out there and people on the ground, it impacted and drove how we thought about a lot of our policies here. Right? So continue to help lead so that we can also lead as well. So when we think about the pushback, for context, when you have DAs communicating, yeah, I don't know if we're going to do that. When you have cops and unions that were moving forward and presenting in a court case, and I think August 18th is when they're going to have to move forward on the next steps of, no, we shouldn't allow 50A to happen, right? Which I know we're going to talk about momentarily. Think about the true lack of humanity that exists, that you have law enforcement actually communicating. I don't know about that chokehold ban. I don't know, you know, because things might have jumped off, and there may be other things that were going on that you didn't see. I'm sick and tired of people always telling me about, well, what happened before the camera. I don't give a damn what happened before the camera. I know what I saw, right? Like, just stop giving me this external excuse of other things supposedly happened that didn't happen, right? As you know, even last night, we had it here in New York. We were being told, if anyone didn't see, and I need to find a video that was mentioned about what happened out in California, but even last night here in New York, you saw cops roll up in an unmarked vehicle, grab someone, toss them in the car, and then immediately it was, well, there were things this person did beforehand that you all didn't know about. And so, as it relates to the chokehold ban, you know, we had to do it because there was always this wiggle room they were trying to give themselves around regulations. And you know, well, you never know, there might have been something more. So we had to make it statutory. But the reason why we have to keep going, and why elections matter and personnel matter, and why we have to keep being attentive on the judicial elements of it as well, is if we don't write the laws correctly and intentionally to prepare for the games that are coming, we'll then open ourselves up for more problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Blake, Michael, you know, we do look to California a lot here in New York. You know, it's the coast. The coast seems to be, you know, they paint us as being progressive, but Michael and I know that we have a lot of work to do still here in New York. There is a current bill that provides that any officers that are terminated for misconduct, or if they resign during an investigation, that they would lose their retirement benefits. And so I know that that's on the floor now. Why is that important?
Why should anyone be able to keep their benefits if they're killing people? Right? If they're not doing their job. And I understand, I've heard the argument and the rationale of, well, what about the rest of the family that could be impacted by that? And hear me, I actually do receive the point. I can acknowledge the point. But if you did your job honorably, we wouldn't be having the conversation. Right? Like, so, you know, I was saying to someone, I know Constance was on earlier. Constance actually did a press call earlier today. And I said, when you have officers
that are making more money after they killed somebody, right? That it's hard for me to really be sympathetic about that. You know, when you're being placed on desk duty, you know, and it's hard to have trust without transparency. And so I think, why are we putting these bills on the floor? Because it will create a level of accountability and, quite frankly, pressure. Because if you know, we're not talking about you losing some vacation days. We're talking about you losing your benefits. You losing your pension. Oh, okay. Now we're having a real conversation. Now we have an extended conversation has to be necessary. And to that point, and I mentioned it a few moments ago, but I think it's important to tie this together. This is why the fight around 50A is so important to that bill that you also just referenced around the loss of benefits and pension, et cetera, because you should not have a job in the first place if you were acting a fool, right? And if you repeatedly were doing things that should lead to you not having a job, that would make it even easier to make the argument of why we would be able to take things away. And so that's why I think it's important that we understand the continuity of justice. You know, it's not just one piece of one legislation. They're all intertwined.
Absolutely. You know, Carmen and Bria, they started off the entire town hall going over the history of policing in our country, which is so important to know that policing started from slave catching and protecting property of slave owners and such. And so, you know, activists, politicians, elected officials were tasked with trying to write policies and legislation that undo those pillars that are working the way that it's actually designed. And so this question is for everyone, because we really want to debunk some of the negative things that are being said about defund, what that word means, defund, and what it is that we're asking for when we want reinvestment into our communities. So what is next? For our viewers that are watching, if you're an organizer or you're in your community and or you're thinking about policies that you want to push your elected officials to write and write correctly, as you said, Michael, how do we ensure that we get these laws and policies that undo the systemic oppression that oppresses Black and brown people? So what are our next steps? What is it that our people can do? Michael, you mentioned voting. Of course, that is a tool. But what are the next steps for those of us who are organizing and doing this work? How do we keep the pressure? How do we connect policy to our marches, our sittings, and our calls, and et cetera?
Can I respond to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that there is a lot of rush to move from protest to politics. And I want to be real clear that no people have ever voted themselves into freedom. And so as we talk about what it is we need, as we continue to say, as my shirt says, defund the police, we are not talking about reforming the police. We're talking about defunding it, right? You mentioned the history. It's important to remember that, as ridiculous as it would sound to say, let's reform chattel slavery, that's as ridiculous as it is to say, let's tinker around the edges and reform a system of policing that is a vestige of chattel slavery, right? It is the evolution of slave catching. That's what policing is, right? And so what's next? What's next is remembering that any time that we've won transformative and meaningful change, it's been because people have remained in the streets. People have made it more in the interests of those who hold traditional power to do what we say than to not do what we say, right? There is always and if you don't, there has to be an outside threat. There has to be, if you don't understand what we mean when we say defund the police, and I'm a little salty right now because the mayor of this city has just stood in front of, printed the words that we've been saying, reimagine public safety, right? Which means imagine, understand that public safety for Black people has never come by having police in our neighborhoods. That is the anti-public safety, right? Nobody Black on this earth, and correct me if I'm wrong, feels, and I know y'all not gonna correct me because I know I'm not wrong, right? Nobody Black feels safer when a cop car pulls up behind you. Not even those who hold political power, right? Nobody thinks, woo, I'm glad there's a police car behind me, right? And so it's really important that we think about what it means to reimagine public safety as moving away from policing and investing in those things that our community actually needs, right? So we have a mayor of this city who is a liberal white supremacist. His name is Eric Garcetti. I'm just gonna put him on blast, who stood behind the words, our words, reimagine public safety, and announced the chartering of a new and permanent bureau in LAPD as the answer to reimagining public safety. They think that somehow if you put the word community in front of policing, that makes it not problematic. We ain't stupid, right? And so it's really important that we stay in the streets, because if we're not consistent and constant in our action, if we don't constantly move towards increased escalation, right? You'll have fools like Eric Garcetti who think they can appropriate our language, flank themselves with skin folk who ain't kinfolk, and usher in things like spending more money on police, like making defund the police somehow magically mean fund the police, right? So what's next is stay in the damn streets. Stay in the damn streets. Make it so Eric Garcetti wants to be president. No, you got a Black people problem. You will not win any higher office as long as you do that, right? The Black folks who think that they can stand there and misrepresent what it means to be Black and what Black people need, right, will also face political consequences. And we have to constantly raise our voices. It can't just be Black Lives Matter saying what we mean when we say Black Lives Matter. It can't just be, we can't let those with political power and corporations say Black Lives Matter and not prove Black Lives Matter. They gotta make Black Lives Matter. So we want folks to put their money where their mouth is, amplify what it is we're saying, and keep their bodies in the streets and plug in with an organization. So, you know, we want you to plug in with Black Lives Matter, but if you wanna plug in with other groups in New York, you know, of course, you know, we got Justice League, we got all kinds of stuff moving. Plug in, do the work, and stay in the streets.
Thank you. London, do you want to give us, what do you say, what's next? How do we keep the momentum in this movement to win, you know, this overall liberation that we're actually fighting for?
Yeah, everything that Dr. Abdullah said was spot on for what's happening in New York. The only other things that I would add for context for what's happening in New York is around the Defund NYPD campaign specifically that folks have been working on. And so I do believe that we gained a lot of traction with that campaign, and we were able to have people shift their narratives around what they think safety means and how police do not contribute to that, because like she said, we're clear that police don't make people feel safer, and that's not what we want to re-envision our safety to be. And so we were able to force council members and other elected officials to start having those conversations. But in the end, we still ended up with a budget being passed that didn't prioritize the needs of communities of color. And so we're at a point where it's that people that are advocating for on the behalf of defunding the NYPD and for this re-envisionment of public safety are on one side of the spectrum, and elected officials still may be having these conversations, but their votes show us that they're not prioritizing us, they're not prioritizing our communities, or to support us in developing a world in which we don't rely on police for anything. And so at this point, it's a matter of reducing the role of the police in our lives in every way that we possibly can, so that we can get to those different levels of safety that are community-based and that are people-oriented. And then also really fighting with Mayor de Blasio and city council members even about this budget that they did pass, because they tried to make it seem like that there were cuts to the NYPD that actually just did not happen. There was a lot of inaccurate math. There was a lot of news stations publishing articles and making reports that the NYPD had been cut by about $300 million in some areas, and that they weren't going to get any overtime. And we know for a fact that those things just haven't happened from what was actually put out. And so there's this false narrative that you're supporting these communities and you're actually not, in practice and with your action, and that also needs to stop. So yes, people need to vote. Yes, people need to have conversations, but we also need to have elected officials that actually advocate on our behalf in the ways that show us in the long run that we are getting what we need, versus standing with us in moments that are for publicity stunts and for the sake of them potentially being reelected or whatever works in their best interest.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to ask you to go next, Michael, because London brought in the responsibility of lawmakers. And, you know, we've got a lot of folks that look like us that are in position of power. We've got brown folks, black folks, they look like us. They sometimes come from our communities. What is next for your colleagues, and how, and you know, Michael, I know you're always in the street with us. I mean, you've been in the street with us on the front lines, but what is next for those who have the power of the pen, who have legislative power to unwrite systemic structures that oppress us? What's next? You're on mute, Michael.
I was trying to be respectful when London was going ham, and I was about to rock with her. So, so first, the numbers that were mentioned and the points were mentioned is absolutely real. The whole cutting of $1 billion, that didn't happen. Like, they literally just moved money around, and that was a game that was happening there. I think that there's a reckoning happening where people are seeing very quickly that if you're not consistent, you're going to get called out, and you'll be voted out, and you'll be held accountable on that, right? That it is not enough just to say, yo, I rock with you, I believe in you, I stand with you. People are like, wait, hold on, but you took these votes 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 6 years ago. You've been real suspect on this. And I think we have to, and there's something that is important that we have too often been in a space that there was so few of us that were in these elected positions that we had a discomfort and a reluctance to call out nonsense and when people were being disingenuous. Now that we have more of us here, we have to be willing to call someone out regardless if they look like you. Like, wrong is wrong. Mm-hmm. And I do believe we are in a space that in this George Floyd, Breonna Taylor moment that we are in. There's been many other names, still more names. We understand that. But I think we got to understand that, at least here in New York, things finally started to move that we've been fighting on for a long time because of what's been going on for the last 3-4 months. That we have to equally hold people accountable, elected and appointed, and be willing to remind people of the positions they took. So earlier this year, I didn't understand how folks were willing to vote on a budget here in New York State that cut Medicaid, sustained and had an increase on prisons, had no additional PPE. I didn't understand how that was happening. I didn't understand how people were comfortable approving an executive order that gave the governor more power unnecessarily, right? But simultaneously, we also have to be able to say, even if I'm not in the same chamber, I'm willing to call out city council members who are not able to say, it makes no sense whatsoever that if you have less money coming to New York, that in any way there should be any conversation about building new jails. That just doesn't make sense, right? And it's just wrong. And so we have this moment of reckoning that's going to happen here in the next 2 years when you have, I think, up to 35 city council seats next year. You have 4 out of the 5 borough presidents, if not all 5. You have the citywide electeds that are on as well. That this is going to force people quickly to get their mind right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because to the point we were talking earlier about retirement for law enforcement, you know, people act differently when they see political retirement coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony, let us know. Let the folks know. People who are here watching, especially those on the West Coast. You know, this is a nationwide movement that we're seeing right now, and globally, we're seeing uh, solidarity marches all over the country. Every city, they're having them across the globe. It's happening, right? This is our civil rights moment, right? And there are people who are watching that are like, I got to get involved. How do we keep what's next? Please share with us what you think is next.
Yeah, I mean, I echo the sentiments of what everyone's shared. I think the big focus for us right now is making sure a couple propositions get defeated here in California, and a couple propositions are elevated and they're passed. Right, we're looking to bring back and reinstate affirmative action, provide voting rights for individuals on parole, and then my organization specifically is looking to defeat a proposition run by a Democrat, so-called Democrat, former law enforcement officer who's trying to roll back reforms, which will really set back not just obviously the prisons, but the spending that we're doing, right? And so there's opportunities to get involved in not just voting, but organizing, right? And being in fellowship with one another. And I think the other thing I want to really highlight is how are we creating the space, right? That it's not just criminal justice organizations or just Black and brown folk working on these issues, but around this idea, what Dr. Abdullah is talking about, reimagining safety and who is holding the responsibility of safety, right? And who plays that role. And so really looking at how we're building out coalitions across health, across education, across labor, across environmental issues, right? All of these issues are cross-cutting. And, you know, I mean, a big reason that's why I work on criminal justice issues, because it's really at the nexus of everything. Of all the racism and all these other issue in environments. So, you know, making sure that we're bringing these other groups into the fold as well, because they all play a role in safety. And I think as we elevate those groups, you won't need police. As these groups, as we all take our rightful place in holding what well-being and safety looks like in health in a community, police won't be needed. So I think that's, you know, the work that we are doing in organizing and creating those spaces for, you know, folks that may be on our side but don't know how their job has a nexus with what safety or justice looks like, and how we bring them into the fold.
Yeah, that those other issues play a part. In the earlier segment, we heard about how even gentrification plays a part, and having our communities that are unsafe. We know that we see that here happening in Brooklyn and in Harlem, and now happening even in the Bronx. And what does that mean when you don't know the neighborhood and then you don't call the police on someone who you don't, you know, because you don't know? And so as we wrap up, I just want to give you guys a last chance to really drive it home on, you know, there are critics that say, well, if you defund the police, who's going to take care of real crime? And there's this idea that we need police for everything. And you started talking about it, Anthony. You know, we do need to look at the intersection of criminal justice reform and housing and health and education and all of these things. So for anyone that's sitting out there that's like, I don't know, but there's an uptick in crime happening right now. If we defund, this is, you know, a little bit dangerous. Just closing up from each of you, what do you say about that, about defunding, and how we're really looking to like reinvest in our communities, for those critics who think that defunding is going to, you know, not allow police to do their job?
Well, we see an uptick in crime because we're in the midst of a pandemic with an economic fallout and people don't have what they need, right? So if we defund the police, we actually speak to that. If everybody has housing, if everybody has healthcare, if everybody has access to good jobs or an income that can provide them and their families with what they need, right, then we'll actually see crime go down, right? Most crime is crime of need. And it's really important to remember that the first thing that we have to do to create safe communities is meet the universal needs of people. We also have to remember, and then I'll be quiet, we also have to remember that police don't prevent crime, right? Police at most respond to crime that has already occurred, right? And they are not the best responders, right? So it's really important to remember that if somebody stole my cell phone, one, all I want is my damn cell phone back, right? Two, when we think about these responses are often more traumatizing to survivors of crime, and maybe Anthony can speak to this for a second, right? We need a survivor-centered approach to addressing crime, right? Survivor-centered approaches don't mean that victims of sexual assault want men coming into their house with guns and badges and further traumatizing them, right? So it's important that as we say defund the police, we understand that by defunding the police, we actually free up the resources to fund the things that actually create safe communities.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Final thoughts for the critics against defunding the police?
There was a pandemic of poverty, a pandemic of institutionalized racism, a pandemic of police brutality, a pandemic of lack of resources for our schools, long before the coronavirus pandemic. And to Dr. Abdullah's point, there are references here that defunding police would be problematic. Well, you defunded our schools, you didn't care about those things. You defunded our communities, you didn't care about those things. You defunded our CDFIs, you didn't care about those things. You defunded, when it came to public and affordable housing, you didn't care about those things. But whenever it came to actually funding the things we care about, there was always an issue there. You know, there's a lot of frames that we could talk through. Brian Stevenson has a line that has stuck with me: the opposite of poverty is not wealth, the opposite of poverty is justice. So let's talk through the dynamic. When you dialed 911, something already jumped off. Okay? So let's be clear about that. Let's be clear that what we are seeing in our respective states, take it here, New York and Cali, we obviously down south is hitting it hard, but we have watched our lives change forever because of a pandemic long before people start paying attention. And all we're saying right now, if you actually would spend time and energy to build schools and not jails, if you would actually lock up the folks that are killing our people, if you actually would hold people accountable in the first place, we wouldn't be having the levels of tension that are happening right now. So I wrap this by saying at the end of the day, I am tired for us apologizing for our existence. It's been mentioned, but let's make sure we don't ignore this. We think about the history, 1845 here and other places. This is here. Police are here because they were slave patrols. Right? Let's not ignore the history and the lineage of all of this. If the whole premise was we are here to catch you and bring us back, you might have taken away the title of it, but it's still the same legacy. So we have to defund it, we have to change the dynamics, and we have to actually invest in our communities. 2020 is a year of perfect vision, and hopefully we're going to see the truth of what's going on in our communities right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Final words, London, Anthony.
For me, in my experiences, especially working with families, my first thought is that police officers don't need to be first responders for a lot of different situations that occur. We have so many people who are trained in many ways to de-escalate situations that will be much more appropriate to do so. And so a lot of this is frightening to people because of the rhetoric that's being shared in the media around this uptick in crime, but also just how different uprisings were portrayed in the media. And so there has definitely been a shift in what's being portrayed, but that doesn't mean that people still aren't going out in the streets and fighting for what they believe in. And that doesn't necessarily correlate to an uptick in crime. It's just a shift in what people are choosing to share on their news stations. And so just wanting to name that here, but also to be very clear that we have to start somewhere. And so there may be a need to just scaffold things in ways that feel comfortable for people once things have been discussed and we do have those transformative changes that address the inequities at the root. Is not ever going to be an immediate entire defunding of any police department realistically. And so the bigger thing for people to realize in these moments is that starting somewhere means a lot, especially in 2020, where we do have this sort of perfect storm with this pandemic, with all of these uprisings happening across the country, and with the movements that we've seen. There's a lot of power behind a lot of people in ways that can yield a lot of positive results.
Thank you. Thank you. Anthony, did you want to leave us?
Yeah, just really quick. I think Dr. Abdullah is right about survivor-centered, and who do we actually think of when we think of survivors, right? Or whose survivor voices get elevated? And I'm not saying that certain voices don't matter, right? But too often, Black and Brown voices in the survivor space are not listened to and not given value. And so really organizing and understanding trauma, right, and how hurting people hurt people. And hurt people, and how we respond to that. What I tell folks, and I have this conversation often with folks around the defund, when you think about police, they spend most of their time training with their guns, shooting, right? Using chokeholds, fighting. Like, what do you expect is the result going to be when you send police out? Like, that's what they are trained to do and conditioned to do. And we need something different. We need a different response. And so we need to be thinking about who's actually trained to do the work that we actually want to see the response. And we want to see folks respond with compassion and love and understanding. And so who are those folks that we need to invest in? So that's what I tell folks when this conversation comes up, and it's obviously coming up all the time. But what do you expect when police go out? This is what they get trained to do. So we need to look at a different model, a different way of thinking, and who should be responding, right? I'm a social worker by trade. And I don't necessarily think I should be responding to everything, right? Because I understand, oh, sorry, that's my puppy. Understanding where social workers have played a role sometimes having a racist history as well, right? And so really understanding and unpacking all these different sectors of life in the United States is important, and being educated on that, and really letting ourselves dream and hope, because that's where it needs to start.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're wrapping up, guys. I want to thank you guys so much, Dr. Abdullah, Anthony DiMartino, London Arnold, and Assemblymember Michael Blake. Thank you so much for being a part of this segment. I know it's late here in New York, but thank you so much for being a part of this Town Hall series. And hopefully our viewers were able to get what they need to be re-energized to keep the fight going.